What's up, guys? To tell you guys the truth, it's really hard for me to get motivated to make a video anymore because I was one of the first 10 channels, at least, on this subject of Mudflood, and I found a lot of truth in the idea of Mudflood. It's not a literal thing that other people really made it into. And when I see a guy walking around downtown Kansas City and getting 10,000 views just for throwing the word Mudflood in there, it's really frustrating because for the first 4 months, my channel did great. I'd get hundreds of thousands of views on some videos. I'd say an average of about 20,000. And then I made a video somebody didn't like. And for the last 3 years, I can't get over 10,000 when I've got 30,000 subs. Anyway, I'd appreciate the comment so that I can screenshot it and send it in. And to clarify, this guy that's making the video here, he honestly believes what he's saying. He's not trying to grift anybody. But the other people that were on this subject at the beginning, they had no regards for any truth whatsoever. And they've convinced everybody that if you've got a basement on a building, then it's a mud flood. Because nobody is smart enough to put a basement window on a building, especially the horse and buggy people back before there was electricity, to let light in and to let all that dank, moist air in the basement out. But okay, I'll play along. Here's my little small town, small Midwestern town. It was built by those mysterious red brick people. I mean, how did these people get all of these red bricks? It's not like you can go find a big bank of clay somewhere and put some fire to the clay and make a brick on your own. But there you go, basement window. It's a mud flood. The whole town's a mud flood. Only Dwayne that owns the lumberyard down here, his grandpa built all these buildings back in the late 1800s, just like everything in the Midwest. And don't worry about those pesky little facts like the name Kansas City came from the Kansas Indians, and that basically 3/4 of all of the towns in Midwest have Native American Indian names. But Kansas City was started as a city, which would have just been a small settlement in 1853, because prior to the opening of the Eads Bridge in St. Louis in 1874, which is why they call St. Louis the gateway to the West, there was one railroad bridge across the Mississippi south of Chicago, and everybody else had to ferry across. So the pioneer movement and all of the wagon trains and all of that had no way of crossing this big, huge, mile-wide river at points. And if that looks like an elephant leading the charge across the bridge, it's because it's a freaking elephant leading the charge across the bridge. Structural steel at that time was still a newfangled contraption, and nobody dreamed that you could actually put a structure across the wide expanse of the mighty Mississippi and it hold up. So there was a wives' tale at the time that an elephant will not cross an unstable structure. So Andrew Carnegie, the magnate that produced all of the structural steel that built America in the beginning, did a big PR stunt and had an elephant cross the bridge to show everybody it's safe. And guys, it's really interesting studying the history of this time because there was all kinds of cool PR stunts and all of these big exhibitions to get your product out to a skeptical public. People had to be convinced that some things were safe, even though today it seems like no-brainers to us. J.D. Rock, he had to convince people that his kerosene was of the highest standard, which is why it was called Standard Oil, because improperly refined kerosene had burnt down tons of houses. And I can go on for days like this about facts from that period of time, but it's really just turned into who can ignore the most history to fill in the blank with their fantasies. Another huge problem with having Kansas City on the Missouri River prior to Western engineering is you've got this whole series of dams going down the Missouri River controlling the floodwaters, because this starts up at the base of the Rockies, all the snow melts, and you have enormous amounts of water coming down the river. This is a meander map of how the old Missouri River used to snake around all over the place. So if you built a city there, it would be underwater without some method of flood control. That's why the ancient American culture that actually did live in this area prior to Western expansion is known as the mound builders, because they had to build their houses up above the floodplain. But here's the deal. This culture was completely wiped out by the catastrophes of the 13th, 14th century. Cahokia was wiped out at this time. Mesa Verde culture, the Canyon of the Ancients, the Anasazi, all disappeared at this time. The Grifters version of the Mudflood says that Tatarians lived here. Well, okay, so how is it that all of the Tatarian structures were wiped out, only the Anasazi and everybody else, we've still got all their pottery, all of their arrowheads, which I used to find all the time as a kid. I guess the controllers were just super dedicated, so they went down to the local creek where I lived and flint napped a bunch of arrowheads and stashed them all over the place to cover up their Tatarian society. So I can go on for days backing up what I say. What have you guys got? A steel door that, hey, if you got 30 grand, I'm sure I can get this fabricated for you. Anyway, let's talk about real mud flood, because there is no force of nature on Earth that will gently bury some buildings to where people can just come in and dig them out. They're still selling the worldwide liquefaction event. This is what a liquefaction event looks like. None of those houses are going to be anywhere close to level because they slid off down the hill and sunk. And it's awfully curious how a liquefaction event 150 years ago sunk all of the cities, but I can still find boulders all through the fields of America everywhere that didn't sink. So just the cities were liquefied. And since this is YouTube, you guys know what that is? It's not boulders. That was actually a giant's hand, and he was reaching down for a giant apple, and he got petrified, and all you see left is the fingertips of the ancient giant. See that little hole on the left? That's where the fascia attached the tendons to the bone. I'm sure some of you don't get the joke there, but I'll explain in another video. Okay, after the world's longest intro ever, this is up in Alaska. The guy's name is John Reeves. You can look it up. And he found in that mud bank back behind him there, literally hundreds of thousands of animals all stuck in that big muck of mud. There's a bunch of bison, and there's woolly mammoths, no telling what all other creatures in there. And he says that the majority of the bone pile is all within a small 5-acre area. Now, he's a gold miner, and when he was prospecting, there was somebody telling him about these mammoth tusks, and he went out there and said the guy just went down and grabbed a mammoth tusk and brought it back. So he decided to buy the property and mine for bones. And it's interesting to see him still using hydraulic mining. If you guys aren't familiar, these water cannons have completely reshaped the western half of the United States. There's no regulations, no oversight. If you could do it, you did it. And if they were after gold, they would take down whole entire mountains like this. And here's some extra credit for you intrepid mudflood researchers out there. What does that say down on the bottom left? Leveling the streets in Seattle. I think I'll actually make a short video on this. But did anybody ever wonder how they found 50 square miles of perfectly flat land to build cities on? Well, they didn't. They had to level the land. And that's why you have old photos like this of all these cities, because there's a ton of infrastructure work that goes into any city before you actually start building. And sometimes you've already got structures that are built on top of the hills, and they either work around them and shore them up, or they buy them out and level it. But I'm pretty sure for some people now this went from mudflood evidence to Photoshop, because that's how it works for photo researchers. Anyway, back to the big mud bank up in Alaska. So they're firing the water cannon, and all of these bones are just washing down and they're just scraping them up. And he said he stopped counting around 250,000 animals. He's just got a whole warehouse full of old bones. In one of the videos, his family's out there, and in one day, they found all of these bones, and they say it's basically an entire woolly mammoth in one day. So let's see what all information we can actually glean off of what's there. I'll try to leave a link in the description of one of the videos. You guys can go watch it. But what's the first question that we should ask about this? You guys can pause and play along here. How do we know that this isn't just where elephants go to die? So the first thing that I asked was, okay, are the bones broken in any way? Because that's going to tell us if they laid down peacefully or if they were all crunched up into this one small little area, which is what it looks like.
This bone was just stuck in that bone. There's this little crack in here. It's another piece of bone that was just stuck right in here.
Now, by the way, these aren't petrified bones. This is permafrost. These are actual bones. He says it stinks there. You can still smell the decay. But bones are still pretty hard, and something generated enough force to take a shard of bone and lodge it into another bone.
Look at that. Chunks of it ripped out, like a huge portion of it. That's gone. Yeah. That's like meat, bone, ripped out.
So she goes on to say that something was eating this, but there's no claw marks, there's no teeth marks, it's just sheared off. This is all telling me that this was a major catastrophic event. But let's look at the bigger picture here. So you see that gravel bar across there? That means that this was an ancient riverbed. Every gravel bar that you find anywhere on Earth at one time had water flowing through it. But now you've got, 75, 100 feet of mud pack on top of it. That's full of a bunch of dead animals now. There was a lot of woolly mammoths and a lot of bison. So what does that tell us? What do bison eat? I can't say for sure about woolly mammoths, but bison generally graze in fields. That's why they were out all through the plains of the United States. So this is up in Alaska. So at one point, it sounds like this was all prairie land in Alaska. Sure, it could have been interspersed with trees, but you had to have sufficient food supply to support the bison there. This is all now permafrost. They spray and they knock out a few feet, and then they have to wait for the ice to thaw some, and then they spray some more. But he did say that it still stinks, so there's still rotting flesh in the pile, basically. Now, other woolly mammoth finds up in Alaska have discovered the whole animal, all of the tissue still connected to the bone. So my overall take on all of this would be that it was a temperate, most likely prairie land up there at one time. And catastrophe struck, which I'll kind of talk about the specifics of that later on, some other video. But part of that was an extreme drop in temperature. And I would say that this baby mammoth was either on the surface or very close to the surface. And so it flash froze pretty fast as the lower temperatures came in. Think polar vortex like we just had times 1,000. But all of these animals that are in this pile were most likely caught up in a tsunami generated by this event. And you got to understand, as soon as a tsunami starts across the land, it's just a wall of liquid concrete, just thick, heavy material, dense material, moving very fast and taking out everything in its path. We can see the gravel bar showing an ancient river here, so this was a low-lying area. So you had all the water, all the mud and muck, and all of the animals and anything else that was in the way, all thrown into the tumble cycle of the washing machine, or I guess that's a dryer. Anyway, the wash cycle. And then as the water was retreating, heading back out to the ocean, then everything would funnel back into the natural river areas. Only now it's full of animals and mud and muck, so it's going to get caught up in areas. Natural dams would form, and the heavier material, the thick silt, and all of the animals and everything got caught up down in this riverbed. The temperature on the surface dropped very fast. Like some of the Siberian woolly mammoths, they've still got buttercups, flowers in their digestive system, completely frozen solid. But most of the flesh has decayed off of the bone in this particular pile. So surface temperatures dropped really fast, and then it takes a while for the temperature to seep down into the ground, into the frost line. So it could have taken years to freeze down the permafrost down to this level. During that time, the bacteria and the whole process of decomposition was going on, so all of the flesh decomposed. But before the bones could decompose, then the area was frozen underground and has been permafrost ever since. So that would be my analysis, arguing in favor of this being a major catastrophe. I'm sure there are people much smarter than me that are already typing furiously about something. There's no such thing as woolly mammoths. That's a Smithsonian lie. Now, the official narrative, do I get points for saying that? Because only smart people say official narrative. Is that woolly mammoths went extinct 12,000 years ago. But it was actually kind of an open secret at the time when Lewis and Clark set out on their expedition that they had orders from Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, that they should be on the lookout for the remains and accounts of any animal which may be deemed rare or extinct. Of course, he didn't want to write that out in so many words, but it was kind of a known secret that people thought that there may still be woolly mammoths in North America at the time. Ryan Edwards, PhD from University of Derby, says that the Kostka tribe from British Columbia was studied in 1917 and found the conclusive proof of folk memory of mammoths. But he goes on to say that it's interesting that where these memories persist, you frequently have high collections of mammoth bones. Just as legends of trolls and ogres in Europe tend to be at their highest in areas where once Neanderthal strongholds, which is very interesting. I'm not going into it right now. But some of the research I've done leads me to believe that these animals were alive in the Americas for a lot longer than they were in Europe. But I'll just end it right here. This is, well, technically a mastodon skull. But if you lived in your little isolated village of the world before universities and all of this stuff, and you found this skull, what would you conclude from this? You might look at it and think that there once existed huge one-eyed people, the Cyclops. It's definitely interesting that we may have the legend of the Cyclops because of the mastodon skulls, but in no way am I saying that this covers all the accounts of ancient giants, because I've got hundreds of accounts of giants' bones being found, and that the Smithsonian really did sweep under the rug. And, you know, one should note that even though they did do a cover-up of the ancient giants, we still have the old magazine articles, the old newspaper articles, all of these accounts, even Abraham Lincoln talking about the giants that used to live in this country. So them even doing their best to make something go away, they didn't accomplish it. But then you think that they actually made a civilization that was more advanced than us from 200 years ago actually go away, and you can't find out anything about it other than they left all the photos and YouTube promotes the subject. Use your head, people. Static out.